Just we'll be talking about bird ringing in Africa, but not general ringing, more about the concept of AFRING to coordinate the whole activities around ringing, similar to the idea of earring. But before I get into the history of AFRING and where it is at, I'm going to just give a bit of my background because it's relevant. First, I studied physics up to master's level, and then I was fortunate. I'd already been a ringer as a hobby in my spare time, and in 1998, I was appointed as AFRING coordinator, so to coordinate the bird ringing scheme, primarily South Africa, but also the surrounding countries, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and so on. And while I was at AFRING, one of my first tasks was to get all the data into a computer system. And only the recoveries were computerized on a mainframe Unix computer. I mean, most people won't even remember or know what that is. Very different to desktops, very difficult to work with. But I, in my first year, managed to set up a system where the data would be in a more desktop-friendly environment. And from there started organizing that ringers could submit data electronically. That took another few years. And then we even captured all the previous data, ringing data from paper, and put that into the system, at least everything that was available. Some records, of course, were lost. Also, while I was at AFRING, I was able to complete my PhD using my own ringing data as well as that in the AFRING database. Then, unfortunately, after 20 years of working at AFRING, the funding ran out. It was a government-funded post, and so I had to leave, unfortunately. The AFRING is still continuing, but there are no full-time staff. There are staff at the University of Cape Town that still keep the scheme running, but they have other duties and tasks as well. Robert Thompson is a lecturer, and he is in charge. But of course, he's got very limited time to spend on AFRING itself. But nevertheless, at least it can continue, and that's great. So when I left, I started my own company, Birds for Africa, to do bird guiding, but primarily bird ringing. So I still do bird ringing training. I lead bird ringing expeditions, and that's what I really enjoy doing the most. Right, so to give a brief outline of my talk, I'll mention a bit of the history of AFRING, where it started, and then mention the main ringing schemes, talk about the AFRING database, because that's where we want the data to end up in, and then talk a bit about ringing training, just because that's a very relevant topic, ringing resources, and then just some thoughts about where to go from here. Right, the concept of AFRING has been around for a very long time. It was first proposed in 1969 at the Third Pan-African Ornithological Congress. And the word AFRING wasn't used, but it was certainly, the concept was spoken about coordinating ringing in Africa. And they even decided to have a follow-up meeting the following year at the 15th International Ornithological Congress. But anyway, firstly, at the third PAOC, there were several resolutions, but the first and primary one was just to have this cooperation between ringing schemes in Africa and with European schemes. And that was passed unanimously. So that's the basic idea of AFRING. Very similar to earring, where all the recoveries from the different ringing schemes are copied into a central database, as well as lots of other information. And the earring webpage has contact details of different ringing schemes, and they also function to help standardize codes and methods and many different things like that. Right, so since then, there were many roundtables and discussions at different Pan-African ornithological congresses. And then in 1998 is, as I mentioned, when I started working at AFRING. And AFRING was part of the Avian Demography Unit with Les Underhill as director. And he already mentioned to me, so I was a experienced ringer already and very interested in ringing, but I didn't know anything about AFRING before I arrived at AFRING. And Les told me about this idea and that he had even been part of some of the discussions in trying to coordinate ringing on a continent-wide basis. So my first international conference that I attended after joining AFRING was the Wetlands International Conference, the second one. And this one was in Dakar, Senegal. And I presented a paper with Les, although he didn't attend, and provided some case studies of migratory water birds in Southern Africa using data from the AFRING database, as well as from the first Bird Atlas project. And so here's just an example. I spoke about the curlew sandpiper and showed this data in the AFRING database, not showing the migration routes, but showing points where birds had been ringed, joined to the points where they had been recaptured or recovered, going in both directions. There was lots of ringing, in particular at Longabaan, that's right down the bottom of Africa near Cape Town, as well as at some other sites, Namibia and so on, and birds from Siberia and different places in Europe. So that's an example of a Palearctic migrant. And then I gave an example, case history of a knobbed or combed duck, which is got extensive movements within Africa. So an example of movements within Africa. And these are mostly birds ringed in Zimbabwe and some in South Africa that were recovered elsewhere in Africa. And then I gave a very short motivation saying it would be really great to coordinate ringing on a larger scale so that these movements and other aspects of bird biology could be coordinated in a better fashion, fill in more gaps and so on. So as I say, a very short talk, 1998, and then thought nothing more about it. And in 2004, AIWA, that's the African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement, the board or committee had given us feedback that they had listed AFRING as one of the primary objectives, number 20 amongst a whole lot of other objectives that were to receive funding. And so we received funding for many years to develop this African waterbird ringing scheme. So of course, because it was from Wetlands International, it was with a focus of waterbirds, but still any infrastructure that was put in place would be applicable to the ringing of any birds in Africa, not just waterbirds. So that was really great. With that funding, we were able to appoint Doug Hairbottle. And so he organized several international waterbird ringing training sessions. The first was held in Kenya on the coast with Colin Jackson, and then one in Ghana, one in Zambia. And I think there was actually, I just don't have the details, one in Botswana at Lake Ngami. Of course, in between these ringing courses, where we invited as many people as possible that were interested in ringing training, or at least for waterbirds. And but in between, of course, Doug was also writing proposals and doing things for awareness of AFRING and so on. Unfortunately, the funding did come to an end. So that was the end of that program, but it certainly helped AFRING a lot with establishing the database that's still now currently in place, and even to be able to accept ringing data from other schemes. And I'll mention more about that later. Right, so as I'd mentioned, at many of the Pan-African Ornithological Congresses, there had been roundtable discussions, and I haven't gone through all of them to find which meetings did have specific ringing roundtables, but I'm pretty sure all of them would have had talks involving ringing, involving bird migration, and so on. And for the last several Pan-African Ornithological Congresses, especially the ones I was involved in, I also organized that there would be ringing events linked to the PAOC. So I've just highlighted two examples, although there were quite a few more. In 2008, the Animal Demography Unit actually hosted the PAOC near Cape Town at Houdini Spa near Rawsonville. And you can see delegates were staying in these really nice bungalows on site, and there was a massive conference center, also hot springs with hot baths. So it was really a fantastic place, very nice birding on site. And every morning, Doug and myself put up nets near the different bungalows, and were catching birds before the morning talks started, probably at 9 o'clock or so, I don't remember. But delegates could choose to go on birding outings or to come and watch the bird ringing. And then another example, so I also had ringing events after PAOCs in many of the others that I attended. And the most recent was November last year in Victoria Falls. So after the conference, there was a ringing expedition to Nampeni Island, which is in the Zambezi River, about an hour upstream from Victoria Falls, although the access is from the Zambian side. And most of the delegates were from the PAOC, although there were also a few Zambian birders that also joined us. And so we really had a great time meeting new ringers and trainees and ringing birds. So it was really great. But it really worked well having, oh, and of course, I forgot to mention, we also had a really exciting roundtable discussion, and Elizabeth was really key in discussing the value of having African rings being used in Africa rather than rings from Britain, France, Sweden, and so on. That may not change anytime soon, but certainly SAFRING is able to provide the rings, and we will keep working at that. But even if rings from other schemes are used, we still would like to encourage that the ringing data be archived in the SAFRING database, and I'll talk more about that as well. But certainly the PAOCs are a key meeting place for discussing AFRING and ringing issues, just because that is the premier ornithological conference in Africa, usually held where possible every 4 years and rotating around the continent in the different regions. Right, so now I want to talk a bit about the long-term permanent schemes, which are SAFRING, and rings from SAFRING have been used mainly in Southern Africa, but also in recent years, especially Nigeria, but also Cameroon and many other countries, occasionally on and off. And then the East African bird ringing scheme. So you can see that marked in red. Now, of course, there have been many, many different ringing events and schemes starting and stopping. Zambia, a long time ago, had its own rings, and several other countries have also, Ghana, also had their own rings at some stage. For SAFRING, the oldest or the earliest record of a ringed bird is from 1909. Now, ringing in Europe started in 1899, at least the official start, when a Danish school teacher put some aluminium numbered rings on starlings, and within a few years, lots of countries in Europe had their own ringing schemes established. And some of the birds that were easy to ring were nestlings of white storks. And in 1909, unfortunately, a farmer in South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal, shot a stork. But when he went to look at it, he saw that it had a ring on and discovered that it had an address, Hungary, and this bird had been ringed in Hungary in the previous year. And this was the first real evidence of bird migration right down to the southern hemisphere. So, of course, at this stage, there was no ringing in South Africa or even in Africa, but this was an interesting record that's been added to the SAFRING database. And there were many more white storks, unfortunately killed by electrocution or in other ways, that had rings on, and these are all in our database. The first actual ringing in South Africa, and well, it's not the first in Africa. There was some ringing before this in Tunisia, but the first ringing in Southern Africa was started in 1948. The South African Ornithological Society, which is now BirdLife South Africa, decided that bird ringing was an important ornithological tool, and some rings were made, and it was decided to first ring some Cape vultures that were nesting in the Magaliesberg, some distance from Johannesburg and Pretoria, and they got the Mountain Club to help with getting to the nests and then bringing the chicks down. The rings were put on, and returning the chicks to the nests. 31 Cape vultures were ringed in that first expedition, and amazingly, the following year, there were already some recoveries reported in Zimbabwe and other places, showing the incredible value of bird ringing. So initially, bird ringing was conducted as one of the projects of the South African Ornithological Society. Then it eventually moved to the CSIR in Pretoria for a very short time, and then to the University of Cape Town, where it was known as the National Unit for Bird Ringing Administration. And then a bit later, the name SAFRING started to come into use. So, as I said, 1909 is the earliest record of a ringed bird in the SAFRING database. 1948 is when ringing actually started in Southern Africa. In 1972, I think that's when Terry Oatley may have started as ringing coordinator. The establishment of a ringing newsletter was started, SAFRING News. And then in 1991, the Avian Demography Unit was established at the University of Cape Town, mainly to run the first Bird Atlas project, but immediately SAFRING was also added to that, and later waterbird counts and other projects. The Avian Demography Unit later became the Animal Demography Unit. Then in 1998, I joined SAFRING when Terry retired. And a few years later, so I'd already been to the Wetlands International Conference, but didn't know that we were going to be getting funding. But I decided in 2001 to change the name of the newsletter to AFRING News, just to be more inclusive, include ringing reports from Kenya and other places in Africa. And so it's retained that name, although it's not functioning as an active newsletter anymore. Okay, I've spoken about 2004, African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement funding that we had for several years. And then 2018, when I left SAFRING, it was transferred to the Percy Fitzpatrick Institute of African Ornithology, and that's also part of the University of Cape Town. So that's just a bit of background about SAFRING. I'm now going to talk a little about the East African bird ringing scheme. the first ringing activities happened in 1954 when Clive Elliott and other researchers wanted to ring red-billed quelea in Tanzania, just because this is the top bird pest species in Africa. They destroy small grain crops, and governments were spending lots of money to try and destroy them wherever they were attacking crops. And researchers were interested in learning more about their movements and biology, and the movements, it was required to do mass ringing. So the first rings were obtained from South Africa, but very soon in 1960, Kenya had organized to have rings inscribed with "Return to Museum Nairobi," and ringing in Kenya started. Initially, they were ringing mainly migrant birds, especially yellow wagtails, but also some barn swallows and warblers and other species. In 1969, Ungalia Lodge was established in Tsavo National Park, and within the same year, they realized that migrant birds were stopping and coming down to rest, being attracted to some extent by the floodlights over the waterhole to view the game, and because of the misty conditions, the birds would come down. And some were ringed, and then in the following years as well, lots of bird ringing happened. But from 1972, it was really mass ringing, and that has continued to this day. So they have had hundreds of thousands of birds ringed. The most common species are marsh warbler, common whitethroat, shown here, as well as thrush nightingale, but really a large number of other migrant species and a few resident Afrotropical birds are also ringed there. Annual reports or nearly annual reports are written, and lots of papers have been published on the timing of migration and species-specific studies and different aspects. So really an incredible amount of ringing, incredible amount of data that has been collected there. So there have been lots of reports, one shown here, but there have been many others as well. So this is probably the longest ringing site anywhere in Africa, and probably also has the most birds ringed at this one site. Even though the proportion of recaptures has been fairly low, and there have been some very exciting recaptures, as I mentioned, there's still a wealth of information from the timing of migration, the molt, and weight data and various things like that have been collected. Right, but Ungalia is an expensive lodge to stay at, and you need to stay there to be able to take part in the ringing. And of course, many, many people have visited and helped with the ringing there. I unfortunately have not yet made that, taken that opportunity, maybe one day. But certainly over time, people realized that there was a need to train local Kenyans. And so in 1994, the Nairobi Ringing Group was started. It's based at the National Museum of Kenya, shown in this satellite Google view. And the grounds are really great. I've joined them twice already over several years, many years ago. And you can see there's some good woodland along the Nairobi River. And so it's really easy to have weekly ringing sessions and train local Kenyan ornithologists. And they've also had some really good data in terms of recaptures and lots of work on learning, aging, and sexing and identification skills. And so that's also a group that's still very active till today. Then also on the coast, There's been quite a lot of activity with Colin Jackson of AFRING Kenya, who has been ringing especially waders in Midas Creek, but also bushbirds, and I've joined them as well at least twice. And Colin was able to write up his PhD with all this wader ringing data that he has done. Again, looking at the timing and the molt and so on. So yeah, those are just some of the key long-term projects in East Africa. There's been ringing in surrounding countries, Tanzania, Uganda, Sudan, Ethiopia. Not as much nowadays as in the past, but certainly, and there are, of course, also scientific projects, researchers coming in and ringing species for specific studies. These are the main long-term projects in Kenya specifically, but in East Africa that I've highlighted here. Right, so that was the section on the ringing schemes. Now, data curation. As I mentioned, SAFRING's got this amazing database. It is a SQL database, and the administrator, Michael Brooks, makes sure that it's backed up on a daily basis, and the backups include off-site backups as well as on campus at University of Cape Town. The data, in addition, there was one point in time where we received funding from SANBI, which specifically required the data to be copied into GBIF. And this map is a GBIF map showing all the ringing data that's in the SAFRING database. So the birds in Southern Africa are largely birds that were ringed, and the dots everywhere else are birds that have been recaptured or recovered, or they may have been ringed in Europe, but recaptured or recovered in Southern Africa. And so you can see even some waders from the Americas. There are some points here missing from Siberia, I think. But nevertheless, this is a very comprehensive geographic spread of data. The points in the Southern Ocean are seabirds. Many of seabirds have been ringed on Marion Island, and some of those have been found at sea or different islands at different locations. So there are well over 2 million records. That's not very much compared to bird ringing in Europe and America, but nevertheless, it's really a lot of data for ringing in Southern Africa, or largely Southern Africa, with some ringing in Nigeria and other places in Africa. We've also tested importing data from other ringing schemes, specifically from Kenya. They are really keen to have the data archived in SAFRING. There are some technical problems, but it's possible, and certainly SAFRING is working on it. And as people try and work with SAFRING to do it, then there'll be more time spent on solving the problem. So the moral of the story is just say that you want to submit or upload your data from different ringing projects in Africa, and hopefully it will happen then. But certainly some of the data is in already, and Colin has promised to add some more of the data from Kenya. For Southern African ringers, it's very easy, and I'll just show you briefly. So the SAFRING website, anyone can view lots of different things, although some aspects are only available to registered SAFRING ringers. For instance, uploading data. So you can't have anyone trying to mess with uploading rubbish. Only registered ringers can upload the data after logging in. So you have to log in and then upload your data into, first you capture it in an Excel spreadsheet. So it's very easy, has to be in a specific format. You have to read all the instructions. But once you've done it the first time, it's easy to do it after that. And then you just go online and click a few buttons to choose the file to upload, and it does a whole lot of checks, data integrity checks, and then it includes the data. So the only reason it's slightly more complicated with other ringing schemes data is that it needs to check, it checks that the rings were issued to you first. For South African ringers, that's very easy because when you buy the rings, it's automatically those rings are allocated to you. And so it's very easy. The data checks, yes, you had this ring number, and so it will upload that ringing record once you upload it. For other ringing schemes, we don't have a record of those ring numbers. And so there are a few additional steps before the data can be added. But nevertheless, the more we do it, the easier that will become. So again, the moral of the story is offer to do it, to submit your data, and that will just make the process easier the more often it happens. Oh, this was just to illustrate the GBIF data. So even though at the top there it shows 2005 to 2009, it's actually from 1948. But I think that was just the period of time that we were uploading the data and checking that the whole system worked. And I think there are still periodic updates since then. So it's not only up to then. While I was looking at that, I just by chance discovered that there are also other bird ringing data sets in GBIF. I was very intrigued by that. But when I looked at it more closely, I realized that it's actually not including the ring numbers or measurements or anything like that. These data sets are simply showing the species that were caught in ringing projects and just uploading the species names and numbers, but not with the ringing data. Nevertheless, it just shows that there is a possibility of also using GBIF as a repository for ringing data, because the SAFRING data certainly does have all the measurements and ring numbers and so on. I'm not sure if it's all publicly downloadable, but I know that it's all in there. Right, but certainly the SAFRING database is there, it's working, it's well backed up, so that does make sense to use that. And the one point I wanted to mention earlier, we can just go back here, it doesn't matter too much, but I mentioned that there's been ringing with Zambian rings decades ago, and Egypt and Tunisia and many places. I suspect that much of that data is completely lost to science. I may be wrong, but I would be surprised if any of that is accessible or usable. Just because it's from decades ago when there weren't computers around, and it would have been sitting on paper, which is probably lost by now. So there's incredible value in having data captured so that it can be used for bird conservation. So, of course, there are many ringing projects where scientists, ornithologists want to first publish their data, and so they are concerned about uploading their data elsewhere, and that's quite a reasonable expectation. But it is also possible to have a moratorium on your data and not to make it available publicly at all, so that it's simply archived until many years after you have left Africa and finished with your project, for instance. So, yeah, of course, there are many, many things to discuss, but I'm just trying to highlight and encourage that ringing data be put in a central database. Ringing is, of course, done on a very, as far as possible, in an ethical way to consider the birds, but I really do feel that in addition, the data needs to be available to really maximize any impact on birds by having that data available in 50 years' time, 100 years' time, when none of us are around. We don't want that data to be lost. We would still like it to be available for analyzing long-term changes and trends. Of course, nowadays there's so much data in terms of atlases and eBird and so on, but bird ringing data still provides measurement data, molt data that's not available in any other bird monitoring project. Right, and that comes on to training. Bird ringing is not something that you can just start doing as you could potentially with bird watching. You need to be trained. It's quite, it needs quite a bit of skill to take birds out the net, to handle them safely and correctly, choose the correct rings and put the rings on correctly, and obtain very accurate measurements. And so training has always been part of the discussions on bird ringing in round tables at the POC and other events. So if you're interested in being trained, there are a few opportunities, and there may be many more, but certainly in West Africa at AFRING at the University of Jos in Nigeria is regular ringing. And the students there, the ornithology students, not only have the opportunity to be trained, they have to take part in the bird ringing training, I heard last year. And so that's really great. I like that. To get that exposure to handling birds and seeing birds close up. There's so much you can learn about a bird when you're holding it in the hand, seeing the preen gland, the brood patch, the wing molt, and things like that, that you can't generally see when you're bird watching in the wild. Right, so there is a possibility, at least for students, to be trained in Nigeria. And in East Africa, I already mentioned the Nairobi ringing group, and on the coast with Colin Jackson. So there are opportunities for training. And in South Africa, when I was at AFRING, we had regular national training workshops. And now AFRING not having full-time staff, AFRING's not able to provide that opportunity, but certainly as Birds for Africa, I've been very involved in training since leaving AFRING. A lot of this has been done in conjunction with Biodiversity Development Institute, which is a non-profit organization headed up by Les Underhill since he retired from the University of Cape Town. The animal demography unit is not really functioning anymore, but he has set up the BDI and is still continuing with bird monitoring projects. And together we've been doing bird ringing training, especially in the Western Cape, but also in other places in South Africa. And also I have been going to countries outside of South Africa. In the past, Seychelles, and since COVID, I haven't been back there, but would like to start that up again. Zambia, I'll be going to later this year. Right, so to see these training opportunities, it's very easy to find my webpage, Birds for Africa, the number 4, you can see there. Google that, so it's birdsforafrica.org. Then go to ringing events, and you can see there's a calendar, and that's updated regularly. And just to show you, also lower down on that page, I keep an archive of previous links to previous trips, if they ringing expeditions or training workshops or whatever. So you can see all the birds that have been ringed there and read about the sites where we do the ringing. And here, just to show an example, the rest of this year, still got lots of events. Some of these are research ringing events, others are training events. But we welcome anyone to join us whenever they're able to. A lot of these, especially those close to Cape Town, are very low cost, not expensive at all. Of course, for international visitors, you would have to get here first. But we try and keep the costs as low as possible. You can see in October, I'll be in Zambia. That, unfortunately, is very expensive, largely just in terms of getting there. The site is Winilunga, which is very remote. It's 2 days driving from Lusaka just to get there, but really exciting. That's not so much a training workshop as an expedition, just to obtain good data on molt and other aspects of birds by ringing, but very exciting. And then we've already got quite a few events listed for next year, but there will still be many more added over time. These, a lot of these events are also on the BDI website as well. Right, then I want to just very briefly mention ringing resources. There are quite a few listed on the SAFRING page, and it's very easy to Google SAFRING. Certainly, if you find a bird with a SAFRING ring anywhere in the world, then you can Google SAFRING, and there's a web page where you can submit the data, and then you will be emailed a report about the history of that bird. There are also a few other resources, and you can browse around, but unfortunately, the web page hasn't been expanded or updated over the last few years. And so I have put a lot of resources on my own web page on a single page with lots of links, and it's just much easier to navigate and find. So you will find that there's a link to the bird ringing manual, PDF, freely downloadable, recoveries of birds of prey. Those are now a bit dated, but still very interesting information, and the water birds. Also a booklet on the ideas for ringing projects, and all the bird longevities for Southern Africa are listed, and lots of other things. So feel free to browse there and see what's of interest to you. It's all geared for ringers, but anyone who's interested in birds can also take a look. Right, so my final section on AFRING is that Doug Hairbottle had set up a web page. It's at the University of Cape Town, but it's a static page. We don't have access to it, and we probably need to set up a new web page to put information about collating ringing projects and so on. But that's hopefully what we'll be able to do in the future. So just some quick thoughts on things that could be included. I just noticed on the Friday for Birds YouTube channel that there are lots of talks, just some of the recent ones, nearly half of them talk or include a lot about ringing or migration. So it could be useful having a page of links to relevant talks, for instance. On Facebook, there's loads of things about bird ringing if one digs deep or searches around. Yesterday I had a quick look and saw this post on African dwarf kingfishers in Equatorial Guinea, where there's a small ringing project. So it would be interesting to collate activities happening in different places, even if it's foreign rings that are being used. What would be really interesting, but this is really pie in the sky thoughts, is having live maps showing movements of ringed birds. That's quite a technical issue, but it's just throwing the idea out there. This is just a static map, but in theory it's possible. And of course, with satellite data, people have often had live maps showing the movement data of birds. Molt analysis, that's just really one of my favored research topics in terms of bird ringing. And I'm starting to now look also at body molt, changes for weavers. It would also apply to sunbirds that molt into or out of breeding plumage and some other groups. But the weavers, of course, are really predominant, showing these changes in colors from into breeding plumage and out. And there are some interesting questions that can be looked at there. Of course, all birds have to molt their wing feathers, and it's fairly easy to learn how to analyze the wing molt. So that's something that would be useful, and that's something that every bird can contribute to, that's handled. Even if a bird is not recaptured, we can look at its molt score, and that can provide really important data, especially in Africa where so little is known about most birds. And then also very important is just having more guides to identification, aging, and sexing. And I believe that at Aplori, they do have this, possibly even online, although I couldn't find it. It may be that it's limited access, but I did speak to Yarkat, who's the ringing coordinator there, and she does want to make it publicly available at some point. I just need to chat to her again. But certainly that's something that's quite important as part of the training to have access to guides that would help with identification, aging, and sexing. So that was just some of the thoughts. There's still lots more, but the exciting thing is that there's still a place for bird ringing in Africa. I mean, there's lots of new technology with satellite transmitters and other really amazing technology, which is great, but there's still so much to be done with just bird ringing, and we need to keep thinking and talking about coordinating AFRING to have this data available in the future and to be more accessible, and to also have this available for future generations. So, thank you for listening.
Pour l'ensemble donc de notre communauté qui est francophone, pour permettre donc cette activité de rester bilingue, la présentation d'aujourd'hui a été faite donc par Dieter, donc le Dieter qui est l'un des initiateurs donc de AFRING. Il nous présente son travail dans un premier temps en nous faisant l'historique des activités qu'il a menées afin que on puisse atteindre donc ce niveau actuel de bagouage des oiseaux. L'historique commence en 98, de 98 où il participe à la formation, par la formation au séminaire international sur les oiseaux d'eau à Dakar, où il est donc responsabilisé pour la première fois sur le bagouage des oiseaux, ce qui lui a permis donc de présenter ses travaux avec d'autres chercheurs au niveau de Dakar. Dieter a travaillé donc de 98 à 2018 en tant que coordinateur de AFRING. Il nous retrace aussi son parcours. Il a commencé en tant que physicien, je crois, et après il a fait un PhD en matière donc des oiseaux. Pour revenir donc au sujet d'aujourd'hui, qui est très intéressant, il faut dire que le projet, je ne vais pas reparcourir donc tout ce que Dieter a dit, donc sur le parcours qu'il a mené, mais pour revenir rapidement sur l'AFRING elle-même, tel qu'il le présente. Alors, de ce qu'il présente, il ressort que le AFRING est donc un mécanisme qui vise à améliorer et à promouvoir les initiatives de bagouage d'oiseaux et les programmes dans toute l'Afrique, confrontés en général de manque d'informations disponibles sur les mouvements d'oiseaux migrateurs, en particulier en Afrique. AFRING donc espère construire un réseautage sur les sites critiques et augmenter les sorties de bagouage sur le continent. Le concept d'un système coordonné de bagouage donc des oiseaux pour l'Afrique que Dieter et ses collaborateurs ont mis a été proposé pour la première fois, comme il le dit lui-même, au cours du 3e congrès ornithologique panafricain tenu donc en Afrique du Sud en 1969, donc ça date d'un peu, et que d'après ce qu'il nous dit, après 1969, il y a eu en 70 également, au Congrès international d'ornithologie, une autre présentation. De nombreux pays sont impliqués et comme je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, c'est en 1998 qu'un document promouvant l'idée de l'AFRING a été présenté à la 2e conférence internationale sur les zones humides au Sénégal. Et l'une des recommandations de cette réunion a été de donner une haute priorité au développement d'une coordination du système de bagouage en Afrique. Et cela a été fait sous les auspices de l'AEOA. Dans les priorités donc internationales de mise en œuvre de l'AEOA, la coordination des systèmes de bagouage, en particulier en ce qui concerne les oiseaux d'eau migrateurs en Afrique, a été considérée comme une priorité urgente. Voilà pourquoi est-ce que dans le contexte général donc du bagouage de ces oiseaux, DIETER a depuis 2005 bénéficié d'un financement de fonds pour pouvoir donc mener cette activité sous les auspices de l'AEOA. Comme il expliquait, de nombreuses activités ont été menées au niveau de l'Afrique, mais généralement, comme vous avez pu le voir, focalisées en Afrique du Sud et en Afrique de l'Est. Quelques initiatives ont pu avoir lieu au niveau de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, notamment au Nigeria et au Ghana, avec bien sûr, comme il le mentionne lui-même, des participations d'autres pays de la région. Alors, pour voir, d'après ce que nous explique l'historique même du bagouage, il faut remonter jusqu'en 1909. Voilà, 1909, d'après lui, est la période où les bagouages scientifiques commencent. Et pour ce qui concerne l'Afrique, il faut venir jusqu'en 1948, où des initiatives ont été faites au niveau donc de l'Afrique du Sud. Évidemment, le parcours est assez long, depuis donc 1909 jusqu'à 2018, maintenant 2023. Beaucoup d'initiatives ont été menées, notamment en Afrique de l'Est et en Afrique de l'Ouest, pardon, et en Afrique du Sud. On peut citer entre autres le groupe de bagouage de Nairobi, le groupe au niveau donc de l'Afrique du Sud. Évidemment, beaucoup reste encore à faire. C'est pour cela que des formations en cours à Plori, à Jos au Nigeria, au niveau de Nairobi et des différents en Afrique de l'Est, au niveau donc de l'Afrique du Sud, particulièrement avec l'initiative Birds for Africa. Alors, comme j'ai promis à Elie, on devrait donc aller très bref pour permettre à l'ensemble des participants de pouvoir poser quelques questions à DIETER. Donc, ce qu'il faut faire, c'est, on va vous inviter, lorsque on va mettre en ligne le YouTube de cette présentation, ceux qui auront des questions, des échanges à vouloir faire, pourront toujours nous connecter pour que on échange encore là-dessus. Et ceci dit, je vais passer donc la parole à Elie pour commencer les échanges d'aujourd'hui. Comme d'habitude, l'élément sera mis à disposition à l'ensemble de la communauté. Merci bien.